Our relationship, I think at that point, things were coming down on us pretty hard, and we started to take care of each other a lot more.
Yeah. We did 72, though.
For 3 seasons, CBS ran one of the most heavily monitored comedy programs in the history of American television. Every script had to be submitted in advance. Every joke was read by a panel of network standards executives before a single camera rolled. Every taped segment was screened, timed, and cross-checked against a growing list of forbidden subjects: the war in Vietnam, the sitting president, religion, drugs, and anything that might be read as a political jab. And yet, on the night of September 17, 1967, something got through that no one at CBS had approved, no one had planned for, and no one could take back once it happened. It wasn't a joke that slipped past the censors. It was an explosion, and it went out live to millions of American homes exactly as it happened, unedited, unfiltered, and completely real. To understand how that moment made it to air, and why it still gets replayed as one of the strangest bloopers in TV history, you have to go back to where the show, and the two brothers behind it, actually came from. Tom and Dick Smothers were born into a military family that had already been shaped by loss before either of them could form a memory of their father. Their dad was an army officer stationed in the Philippines when the Japanese invasion began during the Second World War. He was taken prisoner, survived brutal conditions in a POW camp, and died before the war ended, never returning home to the family he'd left behind. Their mother raised the boys largely on her own, and that early hardship became part of the emotional undercurrent running beneath everything the brothers did later, even when what they were doing looked, on the surface, like harmless folk comedy shtick. Tom was the elder, born in 1937, and Dick came a year after. They grew up in California, and by the time they reached young adulthood they'd found their way into music, not comedy, as their first shared language. The act didn't start as a stand-up routine. It started with guitars and a stand-up bass, a pair of brothers playing folk songs in small clubs, occasionally trading barbs between numbers just to fill the space while they retuned an instrument or caught their breath. What they discovered, almost by accident, was that audiences weren't just tolerating the banter, they were leaning into it more than the music itself. Tom developed a stage persona that was scattered, naive, and endlessly aggravating in the most lovable way possible. Dick played it straight, the exasperated, more competent brother who had to manage Tom's nonsense in real time. The audience ate it up. Their breakout engagement came at a small San Francisco club called the Purple Onion, where a booking meant to last a couple of weeks stretched into the better part of a year because word of mouth kept the room full. By the time that run ended, two guys who'd been earning almost nothing a few months earlier were pulling in serious money every week, and a live album from that era helped put their names in front of a national audience for the first time. Their comedic identity crystallized around a very simple dynamic: sibling rivalry performed in public, with just enough truth in it to feel unscripted even when it was tightly written. Tom's signature line, needling Dick about their mother supposedly favoring him, became a phrase people repeated back to each other for years, because it distilled something universal about family dynamics into 6 words delivered with perfect comic timing. That chemistry, warm but a little barbed, carried them out of nightclubs and into network television, first with a scripted sitcom that didn't quite find its footing, and then with the show that would define their careers and, in a strange way, define an entire era of American broadcasting. By the mid-1960s, CBS had a scheduling problem. Their Sunday night lineup was getting demolished by NBC's Western drama bonanza, a show pulling in such a dominant share of the national audience that it had already ended the run of 2 previous CBS programs slotted against it. Network executives were desperate for something that could pull younger viewers away from the Western and toward CBS instead, and somebody made the case that these 2 folk-singing comedians with the odd brotherly chemistry might be exactly the kind of counter-programming that could do it. The show premiered in February of 1967, introduced by Ed Sullivan himself as a pair of clean-cut, all-American young men, an introduction that turned out to be almost comically inaccurate within just a few weeks of the show finding its real voice. What CBS got was not a tame variety hour. It was a program willing to make jokes about the war dominating the evening news, willing to lampoon sitting politicians by name, and willing to book musical guests who had no business appearing on a mainstream Sunday night broadcast in 1967. Part of the reason the brothers had so much room to maneuver early on was a negotiating decision Tom made before the show even started. He insisted on creative control as a condition of doing the series at all, and because CBS needed a hit badly enough, the network agreed. That single concession gave the brothers latitude that almost no other performers on network television had at the time, and they used it aggressively. Folk singers with explicitly anti-war material were invited on. Sketches took aim at the president. And within a matter of weeks, The show that CBS had positioned as safe, mainstream counter-programming was regularly beating Bonanza in the ratings among the exact demographic advertisers wanted most. The writer's room became a launching pad for a generation of comedic talent that would go on to reshape American entertainment entirely. Young writers cut their teeth there before moving on to define sketch comedy, sitcoms, and stand-up for decades afterward. People whose later work on shows like Saturday Night Live and All in the Family owed a direct debt to the freedom and the friction they experienced writing for two brothers determined to push every boundary CBS tried to draw around them. That friction with the network standards department never let up, and it escalated in both directions throughout the show's run. In the fall of 1967, folk singer Pete Seeger appeared as a guest, his first time back on network television after being effectively frozen out for the better part of 2 decades over his political associations. He performed a song widely understood as a pointed criticism of the escalating war and the administration overseeing it. CBS cut the performance before it aired. Tom didn't let that disappear quietly. Word of the censorship reached the press, public reaction built, and the pressure eventually forced CBS to let Seeger return and perform the same song again months later, this time letting it go out uncensored to a national audience. It was a rare, visible moment where public backlash actually reversed a network's editorial decision, and it set a pattern that would repeat, in different forms, for the rest of the show's run. CBS cut something, the brothers push back, and the fight itself becomes part of the story. The musical guest list over those 3 seasons reads like a snapshot of everything CBS's standards department was supposedly trying to keep off the air. Acts that mainstream variety shows wouldn't touch got a national platform here. Bands associated with protest, psychedelia, and a counterculture that most of network television was actively trying to ignore. It's one specific booking, though, that produced the moment this whole story circles back to. The Who arrived at CBS Television City in Los Angeles in September of 1967 as part of their first American tour, booked alongside old Hollywood names like Bette Davis and Mickey Rooney on a lineup that made for a strange, generation-spanning broadcast even before anyone plugged in an amplifier. The band's stage act by this point already had a reputation. Pete Townshend smashed guitars, Keith Moon wrecked drum kits, and small pyrotechnic charges were sometimes worked into the finale for a bit of extra flash. It wasn't exactly standard practice for a variety show set built for a family audience, but it had happened in some form on their earlier tours without catastrophe, so nobody around the production seemed especially alarmed going in. What nobody accounted for was Keith Moon's specific plan for that particular taping. According to people who worked on the production, Moon convinced a stagehand to pack his bass drum with several times the normal charge, reportedly somewhere in the range of 10 times the amount typically considered safe for a soundstage, and he did it without telling his own bandmates what he'd arranged. The band mimed through I Can See for Miles, then moved into My Generation, building toward the same instrument-destroying climax audiences had come to expect from a Who performance. As the song hit its final notes, Moon kicked his drums off the riser, Townshend drove his guitar into his amplifier, and then the charge went off, not a small theatrical pop, but a genuine blast large enough to visibly rock the set and send a shockwave through the studio. The aftermath was chaos in the most literal sense. Smoke and shrapnel from a shattered cymbal went flying across the stage. A fragment struck Moon and knocked him backward. Townshend's hair was blown out of place so violently that he later compared himself, in interviews, to a cartoon character freshly detonated. Roger Daltrey was thrown off his mark by the force of the blast. Only bassist John Entwistle, by most accounts, managed to stay entirely composed through the whole thing, playing on as if nothing unusual had happened around him. And Townshend, still disoriented from the explosion, staggered over to where Tom Smothers was standing near the edge of the stage, grabbed Tom's acoustic guitar out of his hands, and smashed it, an act so sudden that Smothers reportedly just stood there, too stunned to react. The damage wasn't limited to a wrecked instrument and a rattled studio audience. Townshend has said in the decades since that the blast permanently damaged his hearing, describing a ringing that never fully went away and made playing guitar physically more difficult as the years went on. What had started as a planned piece of stagecraft, a controlled bit of theatrical destruction meant to punctuate the end of a song, turned into a genuine, unplanned injury captured on live television tape, broadcast into homes across the country with none of the usual safety net of advanced script review, because nobody had written improvised explosion, roughly 10 times the intended force, into the version of the script CBS's censors had signed off on in advance. That's the detail that makes this particular clip so different from everything else that got fought over on that show. Almost every other controversy involving the Smothers Brothers and CBS played out over things the network saw coming and tried to stop in advance. A Pete Seeger lyric, a Joan Baez dedication, a sketch about censorship itself. Those were battles fought in script meetings and editing rooms, visible only after the fact through what got cut or delayed. The Who's performance was the opposite. Nobody at CBS could review a charge that didn't go off until the tape was already rolling. There was no version of standards and practices that could have flagged a member of the band plans to secretly overload his own drum kit 10 days ahead of air, because the person doing the planning hadn't told anyone with the authority to stop him. It went out because it happened too fast, and too unexpectedly, for the machinery built to catch everything else on that show to catch it. That's really the heart of why this clip still gets rediscovered and passed around decades later under headlines asking whether it was ever really a blooper at all, or something closer to a genuine on-air disaster that happened to look, in hindsight, like the most rock and roll moment in the show's history. It wasn't a scripted stunt dressed up to look spontaneous for the cameras. It wasn't a joke CBS's censors missed because it was buried in clever wordplay. It was an actual unrehearsed explosion, bigger than anyone involved intended, causing real injury to a musician who would carry hearing damage from it for the rest of his life, that made it to broadcast completely intact simply because there was no mechanism in place fast enough to stop it. Look at the footage again with that in mind, and the moment reads differently. Not a wild stage gag that got a pass from the censors, but split-second chaos that television standards and practices, built for scripts and rehearsal tapes, was never designed to catch in real time. The rest of the show's run kept circling back to that same tension between what the brothers wanted to say and what CBS was willing to let through, even without dynamite involved. Joan Baez appeared and tried to dedicate a song to her husband, who was heading to prison for refusing the draft. CBS trimmed her comments down to almost nothing before letting the performance air. Harry Belafonte recorded a segment pairing a protest song with footage of police confronting demonstrators outside the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. CBS pulled the entire segment before broadcast, and reportedly resold the freed-up airtime to political advertisers instead, a decision that, if accurate, meant footage of a protest against political violence never aired at all, while ad space in that same slot went to the very political interests the segment had been criticizing. By late 1968, CBS had tightened its review process to the point that every script, every lyric, and every finished tape had to be submitted for approval a full 10 days before broadcast, a deadline the writers experienced as a slow, grinding form of institutional pressure rather than a simple scheduling requirement. The brothers didn't take that quietly either. In one memorable bit, Tom played a censor character on air, snipping scripts apart with oversized scissors and cutting other performers off mid-sentence, a joke about censorship pointed enough that CBS refused to let it air at all, apparently unable to see the humor in a sketch that was, essentially, mocking them directly. Behind the scenes, the brothers reportedly started gaming the review deadlines themselves, submitting a safe version of a taping for approval and then swapping in edgier material at the last possible moment before broadcast, which only escalated the standoff with network executives who felt, not unreasonably, that they were being deliberately outmaneuvered. That standoff reached its breaking point in the spring of 1969. CBS cited a missed submission deadline as the official reason for cancellation, even though the show was still pulling strong ratings and had already been renewed for another season. Few people close to the situation believed the deadline story was the real explanation. Sponsors had been growing nervous for months over the show's willingness to needle the Vietnam War and the administration directly, and advertisers pulling out over political content had already cost the network real money. A pointed joke from Dick, delivered as a Nixon impression not long before the axe fell, seemed to be the final straw for a network that had been looking for an exit for a while. CBS pulled an already taped episode featuring another guest's anti-war material entirely. It never aired in the United States at all, only turning up on Canadian television instead. The brothers didn't just accept the cancellation and move on. They sued CBS for breach of contract, arguing the network had used a technicality about deadlines as cover for what was really a decision driven by political discomfort and sponsor pressure. The case dragged on for roughly 4 years before a court ruled decisively in their favor, awarding them a settlement worth millions of dollars in today's terms and establishing a legal precedent that a network couldn't simply invoke procedural excuses to disguise what amounted to content-based censorship. It was, by any measure, a landmark win. It also came too late to matter in the way that counted most to them. The platform itself was gone, and nothing they did afterward, across a string of short-lived revivals on other networks through the 1970s and beyond, ever recaptured the cultural moment the original show had occupied for those 2.5 years. What replaced them told its own story about what the television business actually wanted. CBS moved quickly to fill the slot with a wholesome, apolitical rural comedy show built entirely around corny jokes and country music, a program with none of the satire or controversy that had defined its predecessor. It ran for more than 2 decades, comfortably outlasting the show it replaced by a wide margin, and its success made an uncomfortable point about the industry's real appetite for risk versus its appetite for safe, dependable ratings. Given the choice between a show that challenged its audience and one that simply entertained them without friction, the network, and, arguably, a significant part of the audience, chose comfort every time. Decades later, the fight the Smothers brothers picked with CBS is remembered as something closer to a turning point than a footnote. Comedians and writers who cut their teeth in that show's writer's room went on to shape the sensibility of Saturday Night Live and the political sketch comedy that followed it for the next 50 years, and the direct lineage from that room to later voices in political satire on television is something historians of the medium point to repeatedly. In 2022, the brothers' personal archive, contracts, legal filings, photographs, and recordings spanning their entire career was accepted into a major university performing arts collection, an acknowledgement that the fight over what could and couldn't be said on network television in the late 1960s deserved to be preserved and studied rather than treated as a curiosity. But it's that single clip from September of 1967 that keeps resurfacing on its own terms, disconnected from all the political context around it, because it doesn't need the context to land.